continue the conversation, taking a look at not just the Dudula movement, but the various movements that we have seen coalescing around the very issue of what they call undocumented migrants who are in the country, and the extent to which they feel that the presence of these individuals is stealing resources, is stealing jobs from ordinary South Africans. Let me invite onto the show then tonight Dr. Jakkie Cilliers. He is with the Institute with the ISS. Zwelinzima Vavi is the SAFTU General Secretary and Executive Director at Human Rights Institute of South Africa, Corlett Letlojane. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for your time. If we are to truly understand what is driving the movements that we are seeing, and again, it's not just Operation Dudula or even this Dudula movement that we've been speaking about now in Alex. We've seen it manifest itself in different ways. What do you understand to be at the heart of, you know, this campaigning? Colette, let me begin with you.
Good evening, Kathy, and thank you for inviting us. I think this campaign, Kathy, is a campaign that is leading us into anarchy. The setting is increasing the precedent that has been set up in taking the law, or of citizens taking the law unto themselves. I think it is a campaign that needs to be tackled hands-on by government officials. For example, we've got the Department of Economic and Development. That's the department that issues permits for informal traders, for South Africans and foreigners as well. And the Premier of Gauteng has also called upon all these movements, you know, to end or to stop harassment. And he has indicated that he's going to bring these issues in the Gauteng as province address. And I see that he has mentioned a very important aspect in it, that the province will be embarking on the cultural exchange program within the African continent and across the world. I think this is where the Premier, should be taking the opportunity, to engage with all the stakeholders. Our organization is currently as well engaging with the police, the SEPs in Alexandra, and there is a program that we are running with other civil society like RIJ, Foundation for Human Rights, SAWIT, and Access Action 2. This organization, they are assisting the government to implement National Action Plan on women, peace and security, because women and the vulnerable groups, they live now in fear. We do not see any genuine process or action from our Operation Dudula, actually. We've seen them closing business and exacerbating the poverty-stricken situation that we've been facing, worsened by COVID-19 since 2020.
Dr. Cilliers, one of the things that we are seeing is that by and large, these groups are allowed to conduct these raids, demand that people provide identification, or they are dealt with and harassed. The only time we see intervention is in the case of Alex, where you had physical altercations that, threatened to lead to further violence. Why is it that you believe that is the case? And should they be allowed to be going around in any case? Because again, there's a view by those that are part of the movements that this is South Africans taking the power back into their own hands, and they feel justified by doing this.
Well, I think that South Africa needs to decide if we are really going to pursue an approach that does not deal to the kind of racism and xenophobia that we've seen in our country. In my view, the Human Rights Commission, the South African government, and generally should be taking a much, much stronger approach towards organizations that have any kind of racial or xenophobic exclusion within their mandate. That is a very different approach to what we are doing at the moment, because in my view, organizations that, for example, are are xenophobic in their approach against foreigners, and that their actions are presented and lead to violence, they should be prosecuted. But it's a broad approach that we have to adopt in South Africa. The structural drivers of xenophobia in South Africa is rooted in the economic inequality between South Africa and its neighbors. We are seen, despite our economic problems, as a country that can offer jobs and opportunity for many others. And the reality is that most of the foreigners outcompete South Africans. They are often more savvy, they work hard, they are not responsible for crime generally, but because of weak law enforcement and inconsistent law enforcement, lack of border security, the lack of rule of law, South Africa really struggles with many of the implementation of the measures that can, to a degree, deal with these issues. What we need appropriate laws and legislation that are effectively implemented and in South Africa, and of course that has not happened because of the weakness within the criminal justice system and the state generally.
Mr. Vavi, when we look at some of the concerns that are raised again by South Africans who are part of these movements, these are very genuine concerns around the state of policing, as Dr. Cilliers has mentioned, and really a failure of government to attend to and respond to the needs of society. Will something like cultural exchange programs that are being promised now, are those the answer? Because we've seen this before. We had cultural exchange programs in 2008 after xenophobic violence then. It took place again in 2015. Why is it that we keep going back to the same solutions that seemingly are not consistently held throughout time?
Well, we are not dealing with the crisis at hand. The crisis at hand is that the system itself of capitalism have sidelined and marginalized the greater majority of the citizens of this country. And the crisis is that 28 years into democracy, the black majority, the African populations, are feeling that they are facing a squeeze that nobody is wishing to confront and to talk about. This is a social crisis. This is an economic crisis playing itself in terms of an intense competition between the local workers and the foreign counterparts. This is the crisis that you cannot isolate to the broader crisis that South Africa is facing. We saw snippets of that crisis in July 2021. We're seeing that crisis every day when police tells us that in our country we pick up 58 bodies every day, killed violently close to our shippings between Thursday and Monday morning. This is the crisis of the mental health of a society. The fact that we are now rated as the second worst country when it comes to the social being in the country, the rates of suicide amongst men in particular. This is the crisis where ordinary people are taking out their frustration, the war, for example, on women's bodies by men in society. This is the crisis that is what we call the ticking time bomb in society. When we have 12.5 million people unemployed, when we have almost 70% of the population trapped in degrading poverty, when South Africa, during the so-called democracy, have become the most unequal society in the world. Unfortunately, now the poor are turning against the poor, the marginalized from the rest of the African continent, which are mistakenly thinking that South Africa is the land of honey and milk, are coming in droves into the country in search of opportunities. And they find, yes, South Africans intensely frustrated by the fact that democracy have not seen any real benefits to themselves. And they have become the face of that unemployment, poverty, inequality, which is worsened by the crisis of corruption. So when you deal with that crisis, you don't ask for some cultural exchange. You're asking for what do we do to address the fact that 77% of our young people below the age of 24 are unemployed, that 51% of the African women are unemployed, that 2 out of the 9 provinces have unemployment rate of more than 55%. What do you expect? This is the crisis. And we have been warning over and over that at some point this powder keg is going to explode in our face. Operation Dudula is nothing but an expression of that anger, frustration. But unfortunately, instead of them directing their anger, frustration against the system that is reproducing poverty, unemployment, and inequality, they shift the blame to other victims of failed democracy, failed states throughout the African continent. And that's quite unfortunate. And that's why we're making a call on all of the people who want to join hands with us in search of real solutions to the crisis to do so. We are organizing, for example, a strike on the 25th of April, where we will be seeking to unite the working class against the common enemy that they are facing, the crisis of unemployment, poverty, inequality, which we deny, and we in fact condemn the fact that people think that we would have had a more equal society if Zimbabweans were not in this country. That's nonsense. That we would have addressed the crisis of our poverty if the Mozambicans were to be chased out. That's nonsense. If the crisis of unemployment or corruption would have been dealt with if there was no Somalian people coming to open shops in our townships.
Sure.
That's nonsense. That's not true. Empirically, nobody can prove the fact that the 12.5 million people will be employed tomorrow if we were to chase out all of the so-called foreign workers in South Africa.
Dr. Cilliers, Mr. Vavi is raising an important issue, and it's around really how part of the way in which these campaigns are being carried out is scapegoating, and it really is picking on what may be some of the most vulnerable people in the system. But at the same time, there are significant government failures that have led to the situation that we are in today. Do you think that there has been enough accountability on that front?
There is very little accountability in the South African government or within the governing party. I think that's been very evident, even with the Zondo Commission and everything else. The main challenge is structural, and that is that the solution to South Africa's manifold problems is growth, economic growth. Economic growth translates into jobs and so on and so forth. And we have a government that is not sufficiently focused on unlocking growth and unlocking labor opportunities in the labor market. Those things all have to change. But the reality is, even if South Africa were to grow much more rapidly, let's say at the 5.4% that was originally said in the National Development Plan, more rapid growth will actually draw more foreign Africans into South Africa, because we have a lack of law enforcement and because of the disparity in GDP or in average income levels between South Africa and its neighbors. So it's almost an inevitable situation that xenophobia will remain a challenge going forward, and it will remain thus for decades to come. But if we don't do more to provide jobs to South Africans and allow skilled inward migration of foreigners who also create jobs, and enforce the controls that we are supposed to have along the borders and elsewhere, this problem is simply going to carry on, and it's going to be exploited, as indeed it is, to an increasing extent. So I'm quite worried about the extent to which this is becoming a feature of a number of political parties and movements, and that has entered South African mainstream politics. It is simply not good for South Africa. It does our image significant amount of damage, and we can't live in a society where fellow Africans are dealt with in this manner, and for the only reason that they are not South Africans. So a series of challenges and issues that confront us, and there is no easy solution to this issue. The first, I think, is just the effective enforcement of South Africa's laws and action against those organizations that are so evidently xenophobic in their actions. And these include a number of recent political parties that we've seen ride on this bandwagon. It's very unfortunate.
Corlett, of course, if we are to take a broader look in the region, and again, it's about accountability, there seems to be very little conversation around how the issues that are being raised here, even if it is on a basic level of people being in pursuit of better opportunities elsewhere. When we take a look at the region, SADC in particular, I would think that it also highlights a failure of the leaders in this region to make governance actually work for the majority of people within their borders. All right, Corlett, I think you've got us on mute. I'm just going to ask you to unmute us there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I was just saying that in the SADC region, there's a culture of non-compliance with regional frameworks which are promoting social cohesion and unity and economic development as well. We do have state parties, for example, in Zimbabwe now, persecutions of human rights defenders and continuous violence against opposition and promulgation of laws that are closing space for civil society and human rights to speak. Right now, there's horrible events that has recently happened. The vice president of the MDC has been brutalized. And there's negative statements. And when you look at the SADC protocols, you realize that any member state that implements laws that are in conflict with the human rights principles that are enshrined in the SADC Declaration Treaty, they need to be disciplined. There has not been any action except, I think it was one country, Madagascar, when he committed a coup d'etat, and there was like a withdrawal. There were suspensions, there were strict measures that were taken. We have not seen that happen, even in Eswatini, especially now in Zimbabwe. The situation of Zimbabwe, it needs, constructive intervention. We need leaders, for example, the current leader, chairperson of the SADC, to be even engaging and contacting South Africa and inviting the civil society. There is an article there that recognizes the role of civil society in regional integration, but none of the leaders have made, make it their concern, to bring us on board as citizens, and they recognize, they define who's the citizen. All these problems can be addressed and be dealt with through consultation and engagement with the civil society. We do not even have the SADC tribunal, which has been disbanded because that court was actually effective. Now in Zimbabwe, if there is no access to justice, for example, basic human rights are violated, citizens do not have any means of having this addressed legally, definitely we are going to be attracting more and more movement towards South Africa, because although we mention all our own problems, there is an opportunity for protection of human rights. So we need to bring the leadership, the SADC leadership, all those structures on board and engage them and play a role under the circumstances, because we are in a community of the SADC.
Mr. Vavi, I'm going to end it off with you. And again, I want us to just stay with the broader perspective around how it is that the region collectively can be responding to these problems, because when we look at the rate of unemployment, it's not just high in South Africa, it's high in all of the other countries that are in this region. We all basically seem to be facing the same pattern of social issues.
I normally call it Ipati Lomdom Cafe. This is an absolutely bad omen for the African people, for the liberation movements, not just in our region, SADC, but in the entire continent. The black African populations throughout have been failed dismally by their political liberators. Totally failed. Here in South Africa, we are marching slowly towards a failed state. The doors are written all over a banana republic. And we don't have time to go through what this country represents today. But then look at next door, look at Zimbabwe. Same script, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, the DRC. Then you go up to the Central African Republic, up to the north. We are the richest country when it comes to mineral resources, yet the poorest because of failure, the failed leadership of our country and of our African continent. Now the poor masses who are already drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Red Sea, everywhere, trying to escape the countries from which they were liberated from the colonizers, trying to swim their way back to the colonizers that they were liberated from, so-called. This is a tragedy unfolding. And the rest of the African continent, Professor Cilliers is right, those that are closer to South Africa will always follow the lights of development and they will flood. Yeah, it's unavoidable. And that's why you cannot find a solution that is for South Africa without addressing the political and economic crisis in Zimbabwe. And now there's a war in the Cabo region in Mozambique. And that war will have the impact of getting more people to run into South Africa, same like the instability of Swaziland will unavoidably lead to more people running into South Africa. So the crisis must be addressed at the regional level by all of the leaders, hopefully the next generation of leaders, not those that when they arrived in office, they line their pockets with wealth that they should have made sure that is distributed amongst all of the people of the country.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Let me thank you all for your contributions to this conversation this evening. SAFTU's General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi, the ISS's Dr Jakkie Cilliers, and Human Rights Institute of South Africa's Corlett Letlojane.